Welcome to the All Saints Church. You got me on this. There we go. Rector's Forum. My name is Mike Kinman. My pronouns are he, him. I'm the rector here at All Saints Church. If you are new here this morning or visiting, it is fantastic to have you coming into the orbit of the All Saints community. We'd love to learn who you are. And so we've got green contact sheets at the entrances and exits. Just fill out your contact information. We'd love to be in contact with you. Also make sure that you just spend some time on the lawn after the forum or after the service. If you haven't come to the service yet, we have a service at 11:15. And you can also pick up a red welcome bag on our lawn. We always put our faith into action here at All Saints Church. That's something we do all the time, and each week we pick one thing to focus our efforts. This week upstairs on the lawn on the action table, we're asking people to sign a letter to the EPA Administrator Andrew Wheeler, asking that the EPA deal with the serious widespread crisis of lead in our community's water systems. Right now, the EPA is recommending that the lead water service lines be replaced, in the next 33 years. We don't think that's enough, so we're saying at minimum in the next 10 years these lines need to be replaced. So please go to the action table and sign that letter to the EPA administrator. And then also just to say thank you for the generosity of this community that makes all of this possible. Your gifts, your pledges are amazing. If you haven't pledged yet for 2020, there's still time to do that. You can see me or Terry Knowles. And if you're online, everyone turn around to the camera and wave to everybody streaming online around the world. For you, it's easy. Just right down below where you're seeing me, there's a button that says donate. Just click it, and we like zeros as long as there's a number in front of them. So just go ahead and do that. So thank you very much. I don't want to waste any time right now and introduce and welcome back to All Saints Church Dr. Elaine Pagels. We were looking at,
Thank you.
And as I was looking at the bios for you, it says you're an early Christian historian and an author, and I thought that's laudable and probably perhaps the most boring way to describe you. And what you have done, probably as much, if not more than anyone in the last century, is through the Nag Hammadi Library and through these documents that the church, really in many ways, did not want part of the conversation. You have brought them into the conversation in amazing ways that has really transformed the possibilities and the imaginative possibilities for faith. So first of all, thank you for all the work that you have done in the past decades to do that. That's incredible.
Well, thank you. I'm so happy to be here again. And what a amazing thing it was to find that material. I mean, this is the whole buried side of the early Christian movement. And without it, you don't understand what shape it took at all. So I love this material. I'm so glad, I landed in graduate school when we could start, looking at it.
Yeah. Well, and so, like your books, The Gnostic Gospels, and I've got a couple, some of the subtitles are great. Adam, Eve, and the Serpent, Sex and Politics in Early Christianity. I like that. The Origins of Satan, How Christians Demonized Jews, Pagans and Heretics, Beyond Belief, The Secret Gospel of Thomas, and now this new book, Why Religion, A Personal Story, which I got to say, it's an amazing book, and you can buy copies of it over there. Please don't leave without a copy. And I realize there's not enough copies for everyone, so go online and get one, or go down to Vroman's and get one. But reading this book was just an amazing experience because it is such a deeply vulnerable account of two major events in your life, of the death of your son Mark at age 6 from a rare lung disease. 1 year later, the death of your husband Heinz in a hiking fall, and really how that is intersected with your work and your struggle. As I was reading this book, I felt at the end of it, I felt wrung out like a sponge, I felt intellectually challenged, and I felt full of hope, which is just extraordinary.
So did I, actually.
Good, yeah.
It's a good description.
Yeah, I'd love to start with the process, and a quote that you have often used from the Gospel of Thomas, from Jesus, as you said, Jesus said, if you bring forth what is within you, what you bring forth will save you. If you do not bring forth what is within you, what you do not bring forth will destroy you. And I'd love to hear about your process of deciding to write this book. And do you think Jesus was right? Did you find bringing forth what was in you saving? And is there a way that if you hadn't brought it forth, it might have been destroying?
Well, that's right. You know, Mike, when I first read the Gospel of Thomas and I read that saying, it was an invitation, you know, and I just had to do it. And that's why I wrote the Gnostic Gospels. And that's why I wrote this book, because I thought, you don't have to believe that. It just happens to be true, you know. And I took it psychologically at the time. I thought, you know, bringing forth instead of holding back and suppressing what's happening with you, that's the way I took it. And later I realized it's a theological statement for this. I mean, I don't like theology much, but it's a spiritual statement, because it's about suggesting that deep within us there's a connection with the divine source, which imaged as light, and that if you bring that forth, it will save you, and if you don't, you can fall into despair and depression and darkness.
So what was the process? How did you decide to write this book? And what led you to it? And what was it like to put all this out?
Well, you don't decide to write these things so much. They come to you. This is a book, well, the title is Why Religion? Because that's kind of, somebody said, you don't answer the question. Sorry.
Are you sure you're not a theologian?
But it's the question's thematic, because, as you know, I mean, I was brought up in a family in which my father had given up religion for Darwin and thought religious people would all be uneducated and just innocent and really stupid. And so I was brought up to think that. And so the question, why is religion still around in the 21st century, is a real question for me. Why did I love encountering certain kinds of experience that I could only say involve a spiritual dimension, right? Why do I think we need that? At least I need that. Not everybody does in that way. A lot of people don't. You know, my late husband was a physicist. He didn't think of himself as religious in any conventional way at all. So some people do it in other ways. They connect with themselves and the universe and each other. But I felt I had to write this. This one partly because I wanted to write about the connections between the passions that, you know, that drive us to explore, and what motivates that. And this book connects all those dots, really. But also it was because those losses you mentioned, nothing could have been more devastating than the loss of our son when he was 6.5, his death, and then the death of my husband, which was a total shock and surprise in that hiking accident. Barely a year later, and after we'd adopted 2 children, 2 babies. So we had a 3-month-old baby and a 1.5-year-old baby, and suddenly I was widowed. And that was, I don't have to tell you, it was overwhelming. And because in that situation, you either go on or you don't. I did. And to do that, you have to put in the background the feelings that arouses, because I couldn't have done anything. So it went into what I felt was like a black hole, you know, just the Grand Canyon of just way, way in the background. And then now that my children are, you know, about 30, they're out of the house. I don't have to think about all that. I'm doing my teaching and writing and being with friends and everything else. And all of these things come back. And, you know, if you bury things that are traumatic, as we sort of have to do sometimes, because the brain almost does it for us, right? Either you go back and explore that, or you just leave it there. And I felt that if you don't allow yourself to go to that place, you're not really living your full life. At least I wouldn't be living my full life. I needed to go. I needed to allow that experience to emerge. And that was awful. But it was necessary. Mm-hmm. And the miracle of it, and what I was writing about, is not grief, because everybody here has that. We know about that. But about the surprise of having a wonderful life at this point. That's something I couldn't have imagined.
Well, and your life, it's so wonderful having you here at All Saints, and part of it is your life. You talked about your dad, particularly growing up, but then you had an interesting youth experience in that, two primary shapers of you were your experience with Billy Graham and also Jerry Garcia, which is an interesting combination. But
That's true.
It is, and so, but this is a community where we have many people at the All Saints community who have fled here from pretty toxic experiences of religion, particularly evangelical fundamentalism. And you had sort of your own history with that. Can you share that part of your journey?
Yes, and it wasn't all toxic either. Growing up in Palo Alto, and I just landed in a Billy Graham crusade when some friends went up to San Francisco to see him when I was 14. And I didn't really know what I was in for, but it was powerful. There were 18,000 people there. There were 6,000 people singing. It was extraordinary. And Billy Graham was saying very powerful things, criticizing the United States, criticizing the worship of science, and this country as if it were the greatest country in the world. It's not that I don't think it is in some ways, because I was brought up by immigrant grandparents who felt that way strongly. But I'd never heard anyone talk about science trying to create bigger and better nuclear weapons after destroying 100,000 people at Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and about segregation and slavery. And he was talking about that, and talking about a sinful nation. And I was amazed, shocked. And then there was this huge invitation to be born again and start all over and have a new life. And I was 14, and that was irresistible. So I just went down and got saved. It was great.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. But then you had Paul.
Yes. Well, I joined an evangelical church in Palo Alto. And it was a very close-knit group. Anyone here who's been in those groups, you know what that's like. And it was pretty powerful, and my parents were horrified. But then there was an automobile accident in which one of my high school friends, close friend, was killed. He was 16. And there were others in the car, and one of them was Jerry Garcia, because he was one of our maverick group of friends who were together in Palo Alto. And he was thrown out of the car, out of the front windshield, just straight through the windshield. And a close friend of his, Alan Trist, was in the car as well. And that, I went back to the evangelical church, shocked and horrified and devastated. And I told them what happened, and they said, "That's terrible. Was he born again?" And I said, "No, he was Jewish." And they said, "Well, then he's in hell." And I thought, wasn't Jesus Jewish? But, that didn't seem to make any difference. And I just was so shocked. Even telling you, it chills me to think about it. So I just walked out of there by myself, and I never went back. And that took me out of that group and into dance and music and other friends, and away from evangelical religion, until years later, when I was so curious about it that I went back to graduate school to find out, what was it about anyway, this early Christian movement? Who was Jesus? What do we know? What happened? How did it turn into that, or this, or any of it?
Well, and so that led you really with a questioning mind, with all those questions that you went to college with, and with a stop at Martha Graham's dance studio and in between. And then, the story that you tell, it's really, one of the most extraordinary pieces for me, and you tell this as a scholar and as a child of scientists, and I'm a child of scientists, is these...
That's what happens.
Two astronomers, yeah. And so you had these mystical experiences. You talk about being at Mark's bedside, I believe it was before the surgery, and there was a prayer circle that was happening across the country, and you felt them in the room.
Yeah, I was by myself in a hospital room in New York with a concrete floor, sleeping on the floor because my son was going to have open heart surgery the next day. He was 1 year old, his first birthday. And I was there by myself after my husband had left because he'd been there all afternoon. And I suddenly thought there were people with me. I mean, not physically present, but it was like being in a circle of women. Right. And they were all holding hands and they were in prayer. And I was with them and I realized I could add people to the circle. It was a very amazing experience. And so that, I felt quite peaceful after that. And the next morning, I wrote a letter to Nell Morton, who was here. Nell was at a retirement community, having retired from Drew University. She was here in California. I forget the name of the community in Southern California. And I told her that I had this sense that those women were there. And when I got home a couple days later, I got a note from Nell saying that we were sitting in the prayer circle in California praying for you and your son. I don't know what happened. Right. I don't make any claims about it. All I know is things like that happen.
Well, and then you had another experience with your son's death, and then another experience that you relay in the book about the year anniversary of your husband's death. And so you have these mystical experiences, and then you get into these documents, these early Christian documents that are, you talk a lot about imagination and mystery. And I mean, so you're holding all these things together, so can you talk about that?
Yeah, mystical, I don't know how to use that word, so I don't use it there. Yeah. But I call them experiences I can't explain, which right. is what they are. And a lot of people have had them, right? Mm-hmm. But I was talking with a friend who was a poet, Marie Howe, and she had written a beautiful poem called Annunciation. And it was about Mary, the mother of Jesus, receiving the sense that an angel, an angelic presence comes near her and is very loving and conveying this divine love. And I said, Marie, that's an amazing poem. How did you write that? And she said, well, it happened to me. But of course, I couldn't say that. And I said, well, why not? And she said, oh, well, that's the last taboo. So I thought, okay, I'm going to write about that. Because things like that happen, and I don't know how they happen. That's why I use the word imagination. It's not to say there's not a transcendent reality involved. I don't know. Right. But something happens that is quite beyond what we can ordinarily experience.
Yeah. Well, and one of the things I love is, when you were confronted with these deaths, there were people, there was a police officer who told you of your husband's death, there was an Episcopal priest who tried to give you sort of simple answers that would tie things up in a bow. And they were not only wholly unsatisfying, they really made you angry.
Yeah, well, many people must have had that experience when people say really stupid things to you. Yeah. Well, the policeman who came to tell me my husband was dead said, God never gives us more than we can handle. Yeah. And I thought, how do you know what I can handle? Do you know that our son died a year ago? And you think this is a gift from God? I mean, what are you imagining? It was just so awful. So, I wrote about that because I know a lot of people have that experience. I mean, he was trying to be nice, right? But it's so fake.
Well, and so as you're wrestling with this question, why religion, at the end of the chapter, Life After Death, here's what you write, because you're talking about exploring stories of Satan. It says, above all, exploring stories of Satan shows what we imagine is enormously consequential. Are solutions of the imagination nothing but ways to deny reality, as Renato Rosaldo initially suggested? No doubt that's one way to use them. But having been unable to deny reality, even when I most wanted to, I'm convinced that we cannot interpret our own experience, much less that of our culture, without simultaneously engaging both imagination and rationality. Talk about religion and the possibilities for being that place that engages both imagination and rationality?
Well, I think the culture, the religious cultures, I don't, people often think when you talk about religion, you're talking about, do you believe in God? Do you believe in this? Do you believe in that? And that's sort of a habit we get mostly from Christianity, which got defined as a bunch of beliefs in the 4th century. Mm-hmm. Before that, they called it the way. It was a way to live. It was a way to treat other people, right? It was a way. And most religious traditions, I'm thinking, well, in Judaism, it's not so much about what you believe, but are you Orthodox? Are you Reform? Are you secular? It's about the degree to which you engage in various practices. And Hindu and Buddhist religions and traditions, poems and songs and prayers and rituals and dance and whatever, these are all ways of being, right? Mm-hmm. And that's very important. And so I really feel that this is a part of human lives that is somehow deeply essential. I recently reviewed a book by an anthropologist at Emory, Melvin Connor. The book is called Believers, and he talks about the persistence of belief, and he takes on what he calls the belligerent atheists, meaning Dawkins and Harris and who else? Daniel Dennett. And he just says, they're just wrong. Religion's not going anywhere. Belief isn't going away. This is part of every culture, and it's because this is part of the way we experience life. The other thing I want to say, though, the study of religion, and I feel strongly about this, isn't just because I like it. There are things about our traditions that really are deforming us, or can, right? That harm people. Or maybe something from ancient culture that worked then that doesn't work in the 21st century. Such as be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth, because we need the earth more full. It's different now, the conditions are different. Or the attitudes about sexuality, which were very clear in the Hebrew Bible and very clearly demarcated, right? And they're not so clear to many people now. And the clarity of the Hebrew Bible can be very damaging to people who don't live the way it prescribes, right? So that's what I mean by we have to be critical. And also about the way it induces guilt in many ways, especially when death is involved. I mean, we talk about survivor's guilt. You can feel guilty when your parents die, even though that's clearly way beyond our control. And that's much more obviously so, right? When your child dies, you're supposed to keep them alive. That's what parents are supposed to do. And if you don't do that, if you fail to do that, it feels like a failure, no matter what the circumstance. Right?
So even on that, so one of the parts of the book, I got to read this a couple times, is when you talked about the response to death in Scripture.
Yes.
And how anger, people aren't allowed to get angry. Anger is reserved for God. People are allowed to sort of abuse themselves more, like sackcloth and ashes. Talk about that.
Yeah, that was really interesting. Mike, that happened before my husband's death. I'd written a book called Adam, Eve, and the Serpent, and it was about sexuality and politics, because they're connected. And so I was invited by the New York Psychoanalytic Society to come to the psychoanalytic meeting and give a talk about that. They had a meeting about eroticism, and they'd read my book and they liked it, so they invited me. But then the next topic was rage, power, and aggression. Oh, wow. And I thought, rage, power, and aggression. What am I going to say about that? And then I thought, I know something about rage. Now that these things, that my husband was suddenly dead, leaving me with the 2 children we had agreed to adopt together, right? And I just felt it was impossible. So I began to look in the Hebrew Bible, what does it say about rage? And I realized the first thing it says about anger is about Cain. When the Lord says to Cain, you know, your anger is about to take you over and you have to master it. And Cain doesn't master it, and you know, he kills his brother. And then the Lord punishes him. Right? And in the book about David, King David, it says, the Lord was angry with Israel, and he sent his angel and smote 70,000 people who died in a plague. It seems like a strong reaction.
It's not a proportionate response.
But no human is allowed to be angry. Right. David is allowed to be angry on behalf of the Lord, or Moses is allowed to be angry on behalf of the Lord, but humans may not be angry. If they deal with suffering, what they do is they tear their clothes, they put ashes on their bodies, and they weep. It's grief. Well, grief is there. We all know that. But Rosaldo Rosario wrote a book. The essay was called "Grief and a Headhunter's Rage," and he's a anthropologist. He teaches at NYU, and he and his wife, young anthropologists, they went to the Philippines, and they were studying a tribe of people who are headhunters. And the practice was that if somebody died, especially if it was an untimely death, what the survivor was supposed to do, the man, of course, this is only applied to the men, they go through a ritual and they take an oath to kill the first person they see when they come out of this ritual, and cut off the head and throw it away. And the head carries the anger. That's how you deal with the anger. So Rosario said, this is crazy. They can't mean that. I mean, that it's got to mean something else, something French anthropologists would explore, right? Something intellectual. Then he talks about how his young wife, they had 2 little children also, fell from a cliff and died, and he found her body, and he said his feelings were just unspeakable. I mean, grief beyond anything he could imagine, anger beyond anything he could imagine. And then he said, now I get it. Yes. He said, doesn't it make more sense to acknowledge anger than the Christian fantasies of heaven? I mean, he really understood that, and he wrote about it and said, but in the sort of bourgeois, sort of middle class, especially white Christian West, anger is just suppressed. And it was a powerful essay, and I really appreciated it. So it made me think about how we deal with these things. So when I spoke to the psychoanalyst, and so I thought, well, this minister at the Episcopal Church in Aspen, Colorado, his name was Father Babb, told me not to be angry at God. It made me very angry at him. Because nobody was angry at God. There were all these physicists in a church where they'd never been, because they never went to church. And I thought, you don't even know who you're talking to. It makes no sense. But I wanted to be angry at someone or something. I was, if I drove and somebody cut past me, I was so easy to upset, at that point. And so I thought I would write about Satan. I thought in the ancient world, people would say Satan is the one who throws obstacles at you, but I don't think there's a Satan running around. Satan's kind of a joke. So I thought. And so I thought, I'll just write about Satan. I'll be angry at Satan. That's a better idea, right? Sort of an outlet. So I started to look at stories about Satan in the Bible, in Jewish folklore, and in the Quran. And that was very interesting. So that's the book on the origin of Satan. But then I began to realize that Satan, in the stories of the Passion story of Jesus, in the story of Luke and John alone, is associated with the people who killed Jesus. And I thought, now who would that be? Well, that would be the Roman soldiers, and it would be the chief priests, right? The people who turned him over to Pilate. But that's not what the story says. The stories in the New Testament, Luke and John, associate Satan only with Jews. I was flabbergasted. only with Judas, and only with the Jewish leaders, and never the Romans. And I began to realize it had to do with their own situation of being vulnerable to being executed the way Paul was beheaded, and Peter was crucified, and James was lynched to death in Jerusalem. They were really targets for being subversive against the state, and would be killed just the way Jesus was. So they deflected it, and they told the story as if Jesus were innocent, which he was, I think, of sedition. That was the charge on which he was crucified, sedition against Rome. He was not guilty of that, and they weren't. And they were, well, why then did his people denounce him? Because they were somehow jealous of him. So they make up a different scapegoat in order to survive. It wasn't malicious, because they were Jews themselves, of course. But that's what happened 200 years later when you have a Christian Roman Empire and you have it become a capital crime. You could be burned alive for converting someone to Judaism in the 4th century. Then that little ploy of playing around with Satan becomes very dangerous. And then I thought, these funny old folk tales have landed me right back in the real world. It's not harmless to use the imagination that way. It was extraordinary. So I felt I'd come on the origins of Christian anti-Semitism. And I showed this to a colleague of mine. I was very lucky then that one of my colleagues was Toni Morrison. And she said, but Elaine, she's raised Catholic in Ohio. She said, Elaine, isn't Christianity all about love? And I said, well, it is at its best, but there's a strand of it that's about hate. And that's played itself out in the history of Christianity. And so that's what I mean when I say using our minds, as well as to say not just religion is a great thing. It can also be damaging. It can also be lethal. And we just need to be really aware of that, because these are very powerful traditions.
Thank you so much. I want to give space for just a few questions. We have a few minutes left. A few questions do we have microphones, or am I going to be Phil Donahue here? I'm just going to walk around then. Here we are. So start one over here. Please say your name.
My name is Cheryl Walker. I'm really happy you're here.
Thank you.
I found interesting what you said about anger. I'm very interested in anger. I have a lot of anger. But I also found very helpful A Beautiful Day in the Neighborhood, which I don't know if you've seen.
I haven't seen it. I've heard about it.
Mr. Rogers movie, which is actually all about anger. And what happens there is that he doesn't say you should repress your anger, but what the movie, I think, leads the main character, who is not Mr. Rogers, to do is to express it in a non-violent way, in a way that maybe releases the emotion but doesn't hurt others, doesn't cut off somebody's head, for instance. What do you think?
Well, yes.
Okay.
I agree completely. It's an important thing to be aware of.
Great. We've got her over there. Go ahead, Maggie.
I'm Maggie Cunningham, and I have long loved the saying from the Gospel of Thomas with which you began. And then I came across another version of that said, if you bring forth what is within you, that will save you, and if you don't have that within you, that not having it will kill you. And I was horrified at that, and I was wondering if you could comment.
Yes. Yes, that's an important point. It's the translation of the Coptic, which is really hard, and the text is a little bit broken there. So there are different ways to translate, and if you do not have that, which, there's a break in the text. So you have to interpret. This text was written in Greek, like all the New Testament Gospels. Of course, Jesus spoke Aramaic, and I do think some of this could be well, some of it is most likely the teaching of Jesus, because half of what's in the Gospel of Thomas is in Matthew and Luke. Very common sayings. And the secret teachings maybe also. But anyway, he spoke Aramaic. That text was written in Greek, then it was burned and banned and censored, and a Coptic copy survives. It's the only one, and it's slightly damaged. So we're getting this, not as secondhand, but many later. And you're right, the translations can sometimes vary like that. But I think the other ones are wrong.
Hello, my name is Ellen Snortland, and your books rocked my world. I could never unsee what you shared. And I'm curious how young people are responding to your work.
Well, I love to teach this material because, it is very exciting. I mean, I can't speak for all young people, but we have wonderful students, and they're great. I hear from a lot of people. This book evoked a lot more response than any other because it is very personal. It's a first-person book and much more personal than I ever thought I would dare write.
Some people say that they are spiritual without being religious. I tend to be skeptical because I'm not sure many people can develop their spirituality without some kind of community or tradition. What's your thoughts on that?
I think there is a problem with that. I mean, spiritual, not religious, because community is really fundamental to the way these traditions thrive, I think. They don't have to. I mean, the fathers of the church and the mothers of the church went out in the desert alone, and the records suggest that they could find God in the wilderness, as they said. But I think we all understand. When I was writing the Gnostic Gospels, I realized I was writing for people who cared about these traditions, but were disaffected with the institutions that claim to represent them. So that's what I take it to mean. Spiritual but not religious. That's the way I interpret what they mean. And I understand that disaffection because the institutions can have a lot of, different turns.
I'm curious about your read on the history of women of faith in the church, and in particular what you think about their future both as priests and as supporters of the church.
Well, I'd be astonished if it doesn't continue and increase in the Catholic Church too, because they just can't, they can't fill the priesthood. And the second-rate status of women in churches, Protestant too, many of them, and of course in the Catholic Church. I remember going to Rome when Pope Francis had just been installed and was staying at a convent with a group of nuns, the head of which was an American nun, and they were totally disenchanted. They said, well, he's not going to change anything for women. They can't be priests, they can't handle the Eucharist, it's a total second-class citizen situation and has been for 2,000 years. I hope they outgrow that.
Hello, Dr. Pagels.
Yes.
I sent you an email. I was going to meet you here today. My name's Marianne Vorosky.
Oh, yes.
Hi. I wanted to ask you, because I got the Gospel of Thomas that you had used for your, the translation, so I could read those sayings. And one of them, speaking of the status of women, and I tried to find it just now, but we don't have any service in here, so I couldn't find it in my phone, was disturbing to me, of a woman who said to Jesus, but you need sort of something about, you need to value the body that bore you type of thing. Like, what about women's role in having given birth to you? And his response was not like, that's right, that's a good thing. It was kind of anti. So I wondered, are there things in those Gospels that do also, in the Gospel of Thomas or the Nag Hammadi Gospels, that also contained negative status of women, and that one in particular, and how do you bring
Well,
that forward or deal with that?
That's a really big question, of course. One of the questions at the time of Jesus among him and other rabbis is whether women should be taught Torah at all or not. The stories you see in the Gospels suggest that he included women in his circle, but the New Testament Gospels don't. Right? The disciples, according to Luke, there are 12 of them, and they're all men, and you know who they are. Luke talks about the disciples. He talks about the women. The women aren't the disciples aren't the women, right? And Luke makes it very clear in the first chapter of the book of Acts, which he also wrote, when Peter says, well, okay, Judas left, and there should be 12 of us because we represent the 12 tribes of Israel, and when the Lord comes into his kingdom, he will need us as his counsel. That's what he said in Luke 22. So we need one of the men, and the word in Greek is males, who's been with us from the beginning. Luke is very aware that Mary Magdalene was seen by many as a major figure in the movement. But he deliberately excludes her. He speaks of her as a woman who was possessed by many devils, and she was just lucky that Jesus exorcised the devils. There's no honor for Mary Magdalene in Luke at all. You may think he's nice to women with the Magnificat and the whole picture of Mary in chapter 2, but just get to the end of the book, you know. The Gospel of Thomas is complicated, because there are sayings that speak about the two being one, and the male not male, and the female not be female. When the differences between humans are eradicated, then you enter the kingdom. And this is also, I mean, as I read the Gospel of Thomas, it's a teaching about who are you, right? And saying 61, Jesus' follower Salome says, "Who are you, man, that you came up on my couch and have eaten from my table?" And he says, I come from what is not divided, because whoever is divided is full of darkness, and whoever is not divided is full of light. And I think that goes back to an interpretation of Genesis 1:26, which says that God created humankind, Adam, in his image. In the image of God, he created him. And the Hebrew is singular. There's a single being created in the image of God. In Hebrew, it's Adam. In Greek, it's anthropos, when they translate it into Greek. So it's saying humans were originally a spiritual being. And then he made them male and female. So when they're male and female, they were understood to be differentiated by race, by gender, and then Paul says in Christ there's neither male nor female, slave nor free, Gentile nor Jew. The idea that you have to go back to who we really are before people divide themselves in artificial ways. And then at the end of the Gospel of Thomas, there's a saying that sounds as though Mary has to leave because she's a woman and not worthy of life. That's what Peter says to Jesus. And Jesus says, "I will take her and make her a male so that she may become a living spirit resembling you males. For every female who makes herself male will enter the kingdom of heaven." And I read that, I always think I read that when I was at Oxford, and I thought the whole place was designed to turn females into males. Yeah. And other graduate schools are pretty much the same. But I think that saying is really not about that. It's about giving up identity as difference, because everybody here has a different name, and we're different genders, and we're different in background and family and all of that stuff. But the identity in the Gospel of Thomas is who are we? Not who are you or me, because it's in saying 50. Jesus says this is a baptism. Where do you come from? We come from the light, where the light came into being at the beginning of time, all of us. We are all part of the same family, right? Children of the living Father, everyone. We're not from different families, we're from the same family. So it's giving up that sense of difference between people and seeing the singularity of humans created in the divine image. That's really the message of Thomas. Sorry, that's a long-winded answer, but it's complicated.
And we could go on forever, and it's actually one of the things we need to sort of look at how we can make this time longer than 45 minutes. Unfortunately, not today. Will you come back again and be with us again? Thank you so much. Elaine Pagels, Dr. Elaine Pagels.